I'd like to, at this point, call on Crispen Chinguno, who, for many of us at the University of the Witwatersrand, is well known to us. He's left us some time ago and he's now at Salt Lake. And it's very good to have you back, Crispen, having some engagement with us here. And we look forward to hearing you talk on Marikana for the next 15 minutes. I'm going to ask that both you and Karl try to stick to your 15 minutes. We're wanting to have some engagement afterwards. And I know that people who are trained in the social sciences have a difficulty with the social construct of time sometimes. So I'm going to ask that you try to stick to the 15 minutes. And then immediately afterwards, I'm going to ask Karl to just come up. I won't do lengthy introductions. You will see people's biographies in the program. And so I'm not going to do lengthy introductions at that point. And then what we'll do is we'll have a little bit of a discussion, perhaps a Q&A for a little while after, before we go off for dinner and wrap up for the afternoon and the evening. So Crispen, over to you.
Garth, just if I can,
yeah.
Just for 1 minute. I mean, like many other people here, I've seen this film half a dozen times. And I don't think it would be appropriate to let it pass without at least spending 30 seconds or a minute in honour of those people who were innocently killed. So I'd like to ask that we just have a minute's silence for those comrades, workers, trade unionists that lost their lives 7 years ago and are still seeking justice.
Thank you. I think that's perfectly appropriate. I think we can do that in their honour. Can I ask that you all just rise from? Thank you.
Thanks.
Crispen, over to you.
Good afternoon to everyone, and firstly, thanks and Karl for organizing this very important sort of colloquium, trying to understand the question around violence. Firstly, I would like to say I think it would be very difficult for me to make this presentation at this point in time, especially just a week away. We sort of trying to remember some of the comrades who lost their lives in this sort of like massacre that sort of like was perpetrated by our police post the democratic transition. So it's quite an unfortunate event, but I would sort of like to start off by saying this unfortunate massacre happened at a time when I was in the process of collecting data for my PhD. With Karl, when I was a PhD fellow in Schwab. I was trying to understand the question around, I started this project in 2010, that was 2 years after I started the project, where I was trying to understand the question around how do we understand violence in post-democracy South Africa, how do we explain the different manifestations of violence in a democratic dispensation. So I happen to have an interest in understanding workers in trade union, given my background. I used to work for trade unions in Zimbabwe. And I sort of like grappled the question around strike violence in a democratic sort of like dispensation. So I tried to look at the question around strike violence, and quite coincidentally, I sort of initially grappled in terms of identifying where to, coming up with the research questions, then trying to identify sort of a case study where I'll be able to understand this problem around how do we explain violence and strike, how does it manifest, especially in democratic dispensation. So I ended up sort of like deciding to do my research in the Platinum Belt. And I started this at Impala Platinum Mine. Initially, I had a pilot study at Lone Mill, which I think most of you are aware that it's no more anymore. It's not there anymore. So I tried to look at the question around how do we understand violence, drawing from the experience of Impala, from Impala Platinum Mine. So my presentation is basically sort of going to draw on my experience at Impala Platinum Mine. I spent close to 2 years, like continuous sort of like living in Rustenburg and trying to understand this question around strike violence. And it happened by the time the strike that culminated in what later becomes the Marikana Massacre, I was almost at the end of finishing my fieldwork, but I had to, when I come back, and then this unfortunate massacre had happened, then my supervisor said, no, there's no way that I can write a PhD without sort of like trying to, so I had to go back again and spend another nine months trying to understand this, so which took me from Lonmin, Impala, and all the sort of like, all the mining, all the mines that were affected by the strike. So I tried to sort of like, in a way, where I started at the Impala Platinum Mine, this is where the first strike that resulted in what becomes the strike wave that culminated in what becomes the Marikana Massacre. So unfortunately for today, I've sort of like tried to look at this problem, but for today, the focus of the paper that I'm working is still work in progress. I'm trying to understand the question around worker violence, the worker violence. I understand that they sort of like, there were many different forms of violence, or I would say intersections of violence, and you all agree that the question around violence, it raises a number of questions in terms of when you look at violence. First of all, how do you conceptualize the violence? Whose violence matters and whose violence does not matter? So they were sort of like, in a way, intersection of violence that you see from the film. There were intersection of violence, and many of these sort of like, in a way, many of this violence, so it sort of like raises a number of questions in terms of maybe how do we understand violence in a post, sort of like apartheid sort of dispensation. So I sort of like try to look into the question around the various forms of violence, especially the violence that I'm trying to explain the violence by the workers. How do we understand violence by the workers? So I sort of like try to look at it as characterized by violence between the workers, the violence within the union themselves, and also intra-union sort of like forms of violence. So, but what is important is sort of like, look at it, this strike wave was characterized by a number of repertoires that were sort of, that goes back in time to before the democratic sort of like transition. I'll try to sort of like highlight how this sort of like how this played out in this strike. But first of all, it is important for us to try to understand the violence that we see in this strike, because firstly, it's sort of like the violence, the various sort of like intersection of violence, or the violence that sort of like that was tied to the workers, it shaped some of the responses. At the same time, it's also silenced or closed some forms of dialogue, or it's also justified, it was used to justify other forms of violence. For example, the police, you see, as unfortunately what the police commissioner, then the police commissioner said he used to justify the use of live ammunition, for example, and also invited a number of what I would call violence specialists, especially employed by a number of these mining companies. They ended up employing ex-soldiers from Angola and Mozambique as security guard during these strikes. But at the same time, the violence also reinforced other forms of stereotypes and by way the workers were viewed as the illiterate, the ignorant, and sort of like, and To some, it's sort of like the violence by the workers delegitimize the demands by the workers, which some they saw as sort of like unreasonable, which was quite very unfortunate, because we all understand that the mining history has been characterized by this very violent sort of forms of exploitation that's sort of perpetrated by capital, which goes on for quite a number of years. So first of all, when you look at the question around worker on worker violence, I sort of like, in a way, firstly, when my experience at Impala Platinum Mine, would sort of like the workers, one of the biggest challenges that the workers had related to the question around how do we, because when you talk about workers in the platinum belt, we are not talking about a homogeneous sort of like group of workers. There are workers who are employed by different sort of like subcontractors, the main mining companies. They come in with different sort of like forms of contract. So one of the questions is around about how do we build worker collective solidarity. So there's always a problem around sort of like employers trying to divide the workers on the basis of their contract of the employment. So it becomes very difficult for the workers to forge some forms of collective solidarity. So what happened, sort of like, in a way, one of the ways that this strike was organized by the workers outside the formal institutions of industrial relations, was organized by the workers' informal committees. And we should take note that this is not a new sort of like phenomenon when it comes to the platinum belt. It's sort of like, in a way, it talks to something, but it's not a new sort of like phenomenon. So what happened, the workers had to come up with informal structures from the ground, firstly to organize the strike, and at the same time also to police the strike, to make sure that the strike does not sort of like, in a way, does not break up. So in a way, the workers had many various forms of committee, including a committee that was designed to police the strike, to make sure that there is collective sort of like solidarity amongst the workers. And also, we also witnessed the strike was also characterized by violent sort of like a number of especially intra-worker violence, what I would call worker-on-worker violence. Because of the fact that it was very difficult to forge collective solidarity amongst the workers, some of the workers, because of the fact that they had different contracts, had to report for work in some of the cases. So we had quite a number of incidents where the workers had sort of like, in a way, end up sort of like involved in a number of skirmishes, especially what becomes known as those workers who were sort of like, especially those who were not employed by the main contractors who were trying to get to work. And then at some point, there's also the fact that the strike happened at a time where there was one dominant sort of like trade union within the platinum mining sector at that given time. So, and there had been quite a number of years where there's been a new union that was trying to get access into the platinum belt but could not get that access. So the strike was also characterized by intra-union sort of like rivalry between the National Union of Mine Workers and AMCO, which after the strike became the dominant union. But we need to take note of the fact that when it comes to the question around the union, intra-union rivalry, it's not a new sort of like phenomenon, but union tends to sort of like, union disputes tend to be resolved through violence. And this was highlighted in the NUM Congress report of 2012. So in a way, the fact that we had one dominant union in the platinum sector at that given time, it sort of like was exacerbated by the fact that there was also another union that was in the wing that was also trying to get access to the platinum. But what is important is like this particular strike that started when I was at the Platinum mine was not organized by any sort of like, it was organized outside the sort of like the union. So we, like before the Marikana strike, I attended quite a number of strike sort of like mass meetings organized by the workers. And one of the issues that came out clearly was the fact that the workers, they felt that they had been betrayed by their union, the dominant union at that time, which was the NUM. So I happened to have witnessed one incident where the workers, they ended up sort of like manhandling one of the officials from the NUM, accusing the union of sort of like shortchanging them and making deals with management. And then we also need to, the strike was also characterized by, because of the fact that union dispute, they tend to be resolved in some cases through violent means. We also need to take note of a number of workers, union leaders, they lost their lives through assassinations that may be linked to their role in the strike. By 2015, I think up to more than 12 of the workers, of the union leaders have been assassinated in what was suspected to be linked to their role during the strike. So the question around inter-union violence, it sort of like was exacerbated by the increase in as far as competition for the union, competition between the two rival unions, which had different strategies in terms of maybe how to handle the conflict that had arisen in the Platinum Belt. So where we see that the workers were sort of like who belonged to different unions, they tend to sort of like be engaged in various clashes and at the workplace and off the workplace. So we also see here the question around when the strike started at Impala Platinum Mine in 2012, the mining bosses responded by dismissing all the workers who were said to be involved in the strike. And this sort of like in a way was quite a big surprise to many of the workers who had no choice but to find ways in terms of maybe explaining and trying to find out how they should deal with this sort of like with this crisis that had befallen them. So a number of them ended up sort of like consulting traditional Sangoma to try to explain. As I talked to them, one of the reasons why they consulted Sangoma was trying to explain and understand what was happening and how to get out of this crisis in the same way that like other believers in different forms of religion. So we see here that there are competing views on the meanings and the violence that is tied to this strike. And in particular, my focus in this paper, I'm trying to look at the worker violence. So on one hand, we sort of like in a way, violence, I'm trying to understand how do we explain this violence that characterizes this worker violence? How should we explain it? On one hand, it sort of like means that it's part and parcel of the repertoires of strikes by workers in South Africa, which goes back in history, and at the same time, it's a repertoire for the workers to realize power when they feel they are disempowered. And for some of the workers that I interviewed, they believe that violence is necessary because violence has worked for them before. And then at the same time, we can also see it as a structural response to structural violence that characterizes the labor process. You're all aware that the mining industry has been characterized by very extensive sort of forms of exploitation. And then when you look at the intra-union rivalry, it tends to have been sort of like related to the inter-union factionalism and contestation for power and control within the trade union at the same time. And for some of the workers, they argue that violence for them is a way of challenging order and inequality and exploitation that characterize the mining sector. And one of the issues that came out of this is the contradiction when it comes to the violence that we see in this strike, which is sort of like, on one hand, is quite very corrosive, it results in loss of life, and at the same time, for some workers, they see this violence as a means to get voice and to forge collective solidarity. So I argue that the violence that we see in the strike here, it's sort of like becomes a means of forging collective solidarity and a means of overcoming fragmentation for the workers. So as argued by one of the workers whom I interviewed, he argued that violence brings us together for a common cause. Sometimes violence is the only way out. In a strike, we normally are not supposed to force people but to take advantage and report for duty, and the strike will flop if we allow other people to go to work when we are on strike. So at the same time, I also sort of try to look at it, when you look at the strike, it has its own rules and one of the rules and ways, there's a certain way that there's a certain expectation, there's its own rules and ways of conduct which the workers are expected to respect. And lastly, when you look at strikes, they've got their own rules of conduct and rationale, and which may include certain forms of violence. So in a way, we see violence sort of like occupying a very contradictory sort of like space here, where it's sort of like it reflects sort of like, in a way, it's corrosive, but at the same time, it's a means of forging collective solidarity. And then when you look at the repertoires, most of the repertoires that characterize this violence, they goes back in time before the democratic transition. In terms of maybe trying to understand how should we understand this violence. But what is important here, it's sort of like when you try to look at the question around violence, it's also quite very corrosive in a way that for some of the workers, the violence to them, it also reflects that they've lost their voice. So some of the workers, they felt that Marikana, what happened post-Marikana for them, it's sort of like, in a way, it gave them a voice, but at the same time, they lost it. It gave them the voice, and in terms of, for some, their remuneration, there's some increase in terms of their remuneration, but at the same time, so it's summed by one of the workers, he argued that we have gained the money, but we have lost the union. This is how one of the workers summed up when I was interviewing him in 2015. He argued that we've gained in terms of the remuneration for some of them, but at the same time we've lost the union, referring to the voice in terms of maybe, and especially which also ties to the question around violence and how we should understand the violence in this strike. Thank you.
Thanks, Crispen. I think we're going to hold questions for now. Karl, I'm going to call on you to maybe just give your thoughts for the next 15 minutes or so.
Thanks, God. I must say it's not easy to speak about Marikana after watching the movie. It's a very powerful movie, and it brings back actually the kind of shock of that time. You know, the thing is, the degree, I mean, the shock is quite difficult, and it's difficult to convey actually the depth of the shock and horror that we all felt then. and the sense of having lost direction. And I think we had a sense, certainly on the left, that this was so gross an infringement of everything we had come to expect from our liberation movement and from democracy, that this could not but be a turning point in some sense. So what I'm going to talk about this afternoon, try and offer some thoughts on, is the question of violence and turning points. In some ways, this question was set off by a colleague at the University of Johannesburg, Kate Alexander, who wrote an article about turning points in relation to Marikana. She wrote it, I think it was in 2014, and that was pretty soon after the massacre, and was only able to come to quite a kind of ambiguous end. I mean, clearly she really wanted this to be a turning point, like all of us, but actually was unable to conclude that it had been. She would have been here actually to talk about this, but is overseas at the moment, so is unable to. So I'm going to just try and take up where she left off. So, I mean, I know that for myself, my first thought, well, not first thought, I suppose, but when the full shock had sunk in, was that finally it had become absolutely clear that COSATU, COSATU particularly, but also the SSEP, had become part of the system, had become part of the establishment. Because their response to this massacre was so, well, again, shockingly inappropriate and inadequate. COSATU itself typified it as a strike against the movement, a counter-revolutionary strike. In fact, the NUM, which was the union that had lost out, that was feeling very bruised, was the one that put forward most of these ideas, that it was, as I say, it was counter-revolutionary, it was anti the ANC, it was stoked by management, a whole range of different, actually quite incompatible positions, which reflected their own shock, I suppose. And so the question is, well, you know, to what extent was it a turning point? Is it a turning point? So, as I said, I'm just going to try and offer some thoughts of this. I mean, one question is, what is a turning point? It sort of suggests a change of course of some kind, a turn in the trajectories of the government, of the state, of the nation. It suggests also some kind of structural transformation in conditions. But it also raises the question of at what point does something become visible as a turning point? Is it only retrospectively, you know, with the hindsight of history, that one can identify a particular moment as being a turning point? So the problem here is that in many ways, post-Marikana, it looks as if very little has changed at all. I want to suggest, though, that there have been some longer-term repercussions and shifts which might point towards something else. So the first, so I'm going to break this up into different categories. So the first kind of field to look at is that of the trade union movement. And this is the one where the change is the most visible. So COSATU is the, and for our visitors from overseas, COSATU is the trade union federation, the biggest trade union federation, the progressive one, the one that fought for liberation, along with the United Democratic Front and other movements, and is in alliance with the ANC. Now, it saw the collapse of the NUM on the Platinum Belt, which was its biggest affiliate. It simply collapsed during the strike and in the aftermath. As Crispen pointed out, workers turned against it very strongly before the strike, in the course of the strike. There was intense political division within COSATU after the strike, with its second biggest affiliate, after the collapse of half of the NUM, the mining union. The Metal Workers Union was the biggest union in COSATU. And it had extensive kind of grassroots debates and discussions right across the country about what did this signify for the future of the alliance with the ANC. And they came to the conclusion that the alliance must break. This led to massive fights within COSATU, and by 2 or 3 years later, NUMSA had been expelled from COSATU, and this set in trajectory, in motion, the formation of a new federation. COSATU also lost the food union, which joined the new federation, and since then it's been characterized by a kind of weakness and an inability to mobilize. So that's you know, the kind of result that COSATU experienced. For the new federation, SAFTU, well, it came into formation. It's different from COSATU in that it's politically independent, and it's probably, at least in some of its affiliates, more democratic than COSATU had become. But in other ways, it reproduces old organizational strategies. And there's a sense in which it doesn't seem to represent anything that new. And then there's AMCU, the union that emerged out of the wreckage of the NUM after the strikes and became the majority union on the Platinum Belt. And you saw Mtunjwa, the leader, engaging with the strike workers, and he's really just about the only person who emerges out of the film with any kind of credibility at all. They decided not to join the new federation, but to join another federation, which is itself pretty weak. And unfortunately, over the years, as we've watched the kind of the trajectory of that union, it remained militant. It organized a very big strike across the Platinum Belt 2 years later in 2014, a massive strike. 6 months, I think, it lasted, and it won sort of unprecedented wage increases for workers. And it's out of that strike that Crispen reported earlier, just now, that workers said, we won the money, but we lost the union. Because unfortunately, AMCU has actually become more institutionally incorporated into the structures of the mine than the NUM was. It's actually reproduced and in a sense become like a caricature of the NUM, while it has a very charismatic but also authoritarian leadership. And where workers try and challenge the union and fight for democracy, fight for elections within the union, deaths have occurred. So there's a sense in which the AMCU is not bringing anything really new to the mining belt. So the question that arises here, you know, is I suppose primarily about the decline to some extent of COSATU, the rise of SAFTU, the formation of AMCU, is to what extent is this a new development, or to what extent is it an acceleration of deep trends towards fragmentation and weakness in the union, that were in the union movement, that were existing before Marikana and that were accelerated by the crisis of Marikana. Second, to turn to the platinum mining sector itself, this is critically important because that's where the workers are employed. So the workers there demonstrated an extraordinary level of militance. After the massacre, they continued the strike, as the film showed, for another several weeks and held out for a wage increase, saying basically that to go back to work would be a betrayal of those who'd been killed. So they demonstrated this incredible strength and went on to strike, and then 2 years later went on an even bigger strike. But beneath their feet, the platinum industry is changing. And there's a restructuring happening that is reducing their power. This is due to changing technology, changing market demand, and changing mechanisms of supply in the platinum sector. A profit squeeze and a wage squeeze on the mining companies. As Crispen said, Lonmin actually no longer exists. It went pretty close to bankruptcy and was bought out by another mining company. But this mining company is a specialist in marginal mines and low-wage mining. And that's how the mines in Lonmin are seen, is as not really able to deliver massive profits, and therefore wage levels need to be kept down. Amplats, which is the biggest platinum producer, which is linked to Anglo-American, has chosen a different strategy where they've spun off all of their deep-level shafts, which are the ones that employ large numbers of workers. They've spun them off to similar operators to the one that has bought Lonmin, and are concentrating on their very profitable open-cast mines. And open-cast mines employ a much smaller workforce of highly skilled workers that are more easily managed. So there again, you can see how Amplats is moving out of mining where the union could be strong and into this other part of the mining sector in order to reduce their exposure to militant trade unionism. And the third company, which is it's actually the second biggest company, Implats, I'm not sure, I think they're sort of stuck a little bit between a rock and a hard place. They're trying to get out of the deep level mines into open cast, but they don't have the same kind of resources that Amplats has. So they are kind of stuck. So all of this is not really good news for militant organization for workers over the longer term. Again, rather than a turning point, this looks like an acceleration of pre-existing trends within the sector. Turning to the ANC, I mean, I'm really not going to dwell on that much, except to say that Ramaphosa is the president of clean government in South Africa and the president of the ANC. And he's a man who stands pretty much at the center of much that happened at Marikana. So there again, no consequences. Turning towards the state and the police, I mean, again, I think here that one can see the massacre as revealing an old pattern, as the filmmaker pointed out, an old pattern of massacres under colonialism and under apartheid. And in that sense, a lack of change, a continuity of the colonial and apartheid practices of policing, which in essence look like the suppression of a conquered population rather than anything to do with democracy and citizenship. That guy Mbembe, the general who commanded the force, is actually on trial at the moment. And I suppose we have to hope that this may be the harbinger of more prosecutions among the police and a determined effort to try and allocate responsibility, to point fingers. And then finally, what I want to look at is popular and new initiatives. So, as I said on the left, there was the sense that this is a crisis, this is a turning point, we need to organize. We need to organize differently. And the three initiatives that came out of that, the first was on the NGO front, something called Awetu, which was a coming together of NGOs and some of the community-based organizations to try and look in a more unified way at the national crisis and organize collectively to place demands on the state. That's lasted for about 2 years and has fizzled out. Then there was an even more promising initiative that actually came from NUMSA, the initiative towards a united front. Thanks, Carl. To form a united front of organizations that were wishing to challenge government without necessarily being anti-ANC. That's the range of organizations that have got local problems and various issues that they want to raise, build a united front and start tackling government and trying to ensure accountability of government. That also was in some way, it again was a very promising initiative, I think, and it was abandoned or closed down by NUMSA after 2 or 3 years. And there still are some remnants around, but as a national initiative supported by the union, that's run out of steam. Because the union turned its attention towards launching a workers' party. And the Workers' Party was launched last year, and that has been a frustrating initiative. Again, it was seen as something new and refreshing on the part of the left, but it was very narrowly formed. It's very much a Marxist-Leninist party, pretty much in the mold of the old Communist Party, which is linked to the ANC, and threw itself into the elections, won, I think, 20,000 votes or thereabouts, and doesn't really have a base of any kind. There's something like 300,000 metal workers in the union, but only 20,000 votes for the party, which suggests that it doesn't really have mass support, certainly at this point among workers. So by and large, the kinds of new forces that we thought would emerge on this terrain of national crisis have not really produced much. The that is a bit different is the EFF, the Economic Freedom Fighters. Now this didn't emerge because of Marikana. It was a breakaway from the ANC, a breakaway by the youth from the ANC. But it was able to mobilize the Marikana moment as a founding moment for itself, as an alternative political party. It presented itself as radical with a militant rhetoric, appeared to occupy a space to the left of the ANC, and challenged the ANC at every point. It was particularly hostile to President Zuma. But since the demise of Zuma, or at least the demise of Zuma, whether it's permanent or temporary, we don't know, it's become, the EFF has become increasingly ambiguous and hostile, ambiguous and populist in its rhetoric and in its positioning. The leadership seems more geared towards protecting itself from potential charges for corruption by a more determined national prosecuting authority post-Ramaphosa. While in some communities it retains a mobilized base contesting local problems. So in that sense it remains a nexus for a series of quite contradictory forces and pressures and possibilities. It must also be said that it is the political party that made the most progress in the recent national elections, pretty much doubling its seats. So it's clearly got steam, it's got oomph, it's growing, compared to the other popular initiatives that I mentioned. So just, I mean, to conclude then in a very tentative way, because that's all that's possible at this point, 7 years post Marikana. So far, it's crystallized and accelerated existing trends in the mining sector and the labor movement, and perhaps in the police. In other words, towards a more authoritarian and massacre-prone police. There have been no big political ruptures or shifts. It has produced some modest new initiatives, a new Labour Federation, the EFF, those two in particular, which have yet to demonstrate whether they have significant potential to change the movement landscape in South Africa. And then a final thought, because what was really important about Marikana, I mean, what the movie doesn't show, is that it was actually a series of rolling strikes across the three biggest platinum companies. Massive strikes. Something like 100,000 workers came out successively across the different mining companies. 2 years later, there was another very big strike across the platinum sector, this time organized by the union. But the initial strikes were organized by workers from below, outside of union structures, by their own committees without the union. As the movie pointed out, there were a wave of strikes after Marikana, where Marikana was taken as an inspiration by workers and movements across the country. A number of these happened on mines across the country, but most significant perhaps was the strike of farm workers in the Western Cape. Farm workers on the vineyards, on the grape farms, wine farms as well as table grape farms. And there again, it's estimated that something like 100,000 workers came out, organizing themselves. No union structure, there were some NGOs trying to organize them, but they were much bigger than the organization that had preceded that moment. And they also won quite an extraordinary wage increase, which almost doubled their wages, where the minimum wage, the promulgated regulated minimum wage for farm workers was almost doubled. And that was a strike without organization. And then a couple of years later, we have on the campuses the emergence of #FeesMustFall, a student movement, again outside of the organizational structures, drawing on some of the organizational structures that existed, but very much emerging with new practices and new structures in the moment of struggle. And this leads to a question. Well, let me put it this way. If Marikana, in some sense, turns out to be a turning point, that will have been because of autonomous mass action by workers from below. The question that arises when we look back at these episodes of struggle, these waves of struggle over the past 7 years or so, is it sort of seems, do they suggest that a real turning point may be produced when waves of mass action converge into something bigger? Waves of mass action organized in this way, in the way that I've just described, without the formal organizational structures. In a sense, spontaneous, although we all know that spontaneity is not really spontaneity. Without mediation by organizations such as unions, NGOs, political parties, and so on. And could that be the moment in which Marikana is resurrected? And what kind of turning point might that produce? And I'm saying that, I'm raising that question advisedly because I'm thinking of the experience of Brazil with the 2013 mass movement, challenging the Workers' Party regime, which from a progressive, from a left perspective, not in not such a different way from what I've described, ultimately led to a turning point which was the parliamentary coup against a weakened Workers' Party and a right to counter-revolution. That's also a possible outcome of turning points. And Hong Kong at the moment, again, a series of mass struggles organized with, without the formal organizational mediation, although there are organizations, including the trade union movement, right in the thick of it. But with what kind of outcome? What kind of outcome is possible? Is it the protection of democracy in Hong Kong, or is it going to be an invitation to an authoritarian coup, in effect, from China? So those are the kinds of questions that any talk of turning points necessarily has to raise. So on that sort of note, Garth, I'll just leave it there.
Thank you, Karl. Thank you, Crispen. I think we've got, I know that we're scheduled to have dinner soon. People are probably hungry. But we do have about 20 minutes to just take some questions, comments about the day, about the film screening, about some of the inputs made by Crispen and by Karl. And so I'm going to open it to the floor at this point. I think we'll take a round of 2 or 3 at a time. I'll start with this side. 1, 2, 3.
Thank you. Well, I'm going to react to the last point that you raised, Karl. This spontaneous organization of opposition to exploitation of organization of informal organization of struggle. I don't know if you can actually speak of informal organization. It sounds contradictory, but that's what you were alluded to when you mentioned that spontaneity is not necessarily spontaneity. And I was thinking one example that you could have mentioned is coming from a French-speaking country. Of course, it's the Gilets jaunes in France. It was kind of spontaneous. It was not controlled by the unions, and it stalled the action of the French government for months and months and months. I mean, basically, the government of France has had to stop all its projects and policies to manage this and kind of make it go away. But what struck me was the violence of the response from this supposedly democratic government. And the impression that this gives me is that the more apparently an organized movement of protest, the more threatening the government is, the more insecure it feels, and the more violent it can become. And I wonder if this is not what was happening in Marikana. The sense that they had that they cannot control this via formal organizations, so they really have to unleash just this completely insane level of violence. Maybe also I will tag a question to this. Do you think, Karl, and also you, Crispen, that something like Marikana is still possible? I mean, in South Africa today, and if that is the case, then there is no change, there is no turning point. But in my opinion, that you can elaborate on that.
Thanks. The film portrays the workers as not violent except in retaliation, so that every time they're violent it's only in retaliation. Whereas Crispen, your studies clearly are of violence long before Marikana and inter-minor kind of violence. So, that really does pose some questions about the accuracy of the thought. But in a way, what I want to ask you, Crispen, is I was really struck by how, in the film, the workers really expected to get reasonable responses, and how they were quite reasonable with Mpembe, in saying, they weren't looking for a confrontation in which they would get killed, and they seemed not to understand until Mtunja spoke that they were going to get killed. So how, and to me that's one of the most tragic things about it all, is that people didn't expect to be mown down like that. They expected reasonableness. And how does that reconcile with the fact that at the same time, from what your research implies, they've got some really, they need to use violence in the violent conditions of their lives and in order to give themselves agency and to sort of assert themselves. That sort of combination of expecting reasonableness but also knowing they have to rely on violence.
We'll take one more, will you?
Is this on?
Yes, it is.
Yes, okay, fine. Just to qualify my question, I'm not an academic, so if my question is a bit wishy-washy, it's because I'm just wondering generalities. Keep it open. I just want to comment from Karl. As Karl, since you lived in this country longer than me, perhaps, you probably recall the Goldstein Commission, the Serenity Commission, Marikana Commission, TRC, Zondo Commission, and certainly the Zondo Commission is happening during the fractured state. What is your take on these commissions? Are they really helping South Africa to progress or regress? That's maybe the first question. The second question is more of a story behind the story in Marikana. Okay, so there's Marikana that we witnessed on the video. But what's the story beyond that? In other ways, Ronnie Castle's kind of like really touch upon it a little bit in his line of questioning on the video itself. So that's what I'm trying to understand. But I also know, looking at all conflict, or most conflict, whether you go as back as the Second World War or any conflict, it is some kind of a science. The conflicts tend to be, or the victims or the people, they tend to be used as a guinea pigs. In other words, there's some science there, whether it's social science, whether you're testing weapons, but there's some kind of a science in most of this conflict. So what was the science in Marikana? Of course, we're studying Marikana. We're using Marikana today as a case. I've been to so many Marikana events that look at Marikana and analyze and dissect Marikana. But what was the real science behind Marikana? Thank you.
Karl, Crispen, would like to address.
Thanks for the questions. For me, when you look at the question around the violence that characterizes this strike, maybe we need to go back to the fact that when you look at, especially in the mining sector, for example, there's very little that has changed in terms of our sort of like model of capitalism. Still very much depend on very black and exploited sort of labor. There's very little change in terms of maybe what it was before democracy in 1984. And then we also need to question around the state when you look at it in terms of maybe what is the state in terms of in relation to the workers and the capital, whose interest does the state sort of like represent. So we see in this is a typical example where we see the state is not just a neutral sort of like as an institution in society, but it's there to advance the interests of a particular class, in this case, which sort of like the business. Then when you look at the question around the workers, yeah, I would agree. They did not expect like all of us. We thought maybe 20 years after the democratic dispensation, something like this was never going to happen. But unfortunately, this sort of like this happened. But it goes back to the question around the state. It's sort of like in a way it's not a neutral sort of like institution. It's there to advance the interests of a particular class. Then we come to the question around violence and agency. The workers using violence as a form of agency. It talks to the question around the fact that the workers, it talks to the contradictory nature of violence, how we should understand violence. And sometimes it's sort of like, for the workers, that was the only means that sort of like brought them together, sort of as a form of collective solidarity. But for some, you see it as something that is, so violence it's sort of like a paradox when you look at it.
Yep, so is another Marikana possible? I mean, I think that it is. I think it's highly unlikely in the immediate short term. And I highly doubt that the president of the country is going to get himself involved in another massacre. We don't know how long he's still going to be the president of the country for. But I do think that this is why I made that comment. There have been some movements to try to reform policing, but it doesn't look very convincing at this point. And I think that the response of the police in Marikana was a much more deeply felt and recognizable organizational response to this kind of situation than the reform initiatives are. And it matches a whole lot of other rhetoric and so on. I mean, Nicholas Smith, who's going to be talking later in the colloquium, talks about the South African state as a vigilante state. One that where policing, faced with a crime situation that it's unable to deal with in other ways, resorts to vigilante policing. In other words, policing outside of the law. And Marikana can be seen as a spectacular form of vigilante policing. So I think it is possible. And then, so one way of looking at that would be to say that no, it wasn't a turning point. On the other hand, it could be exactly the kind of turning point that retrospectively inaugurates a regime where policing is very different from democratic norms. On the question of commissions, that's a complicated question, and I'm very much tempted to push it to Callie Forrest, who's in the audience today, who's at SWAP and who actually did a lot of work on the Farland Commission and has looked at commissions historically. Certainly a lot of the time commissions are used to bat things into out of touch, into a sort of neutral territory where nothing happens and time passes and then even less happens. But not all commissions are like that or have been like that. So it partly depends on how the administration is trying to use the commission, I think. In this case, certainly, I suppose the state at that time, the government at that time, had to respond in some way to what they typified as a tragedy rather than a massacre. And the only way that they could do that, they had to show like a degree of concern, but at the same time try and neutralize it, and the commission was a way of doing it. On what's behind Marikana, well, I think that I don't think there's any science behind Marikana, and I don't think it was an experiment. I think that there are two stories, and the main one, the big one, is that the ANC and the Tripartite Alliance more broadly were unable, probably are still unable, to accept the legitimacy of mass mobilization outside of the Tripartite Alliance. So COSATU has mobilized many strikes. It's got into big fights with the ANC. It's fine because it's inside the family. other organizations as well. So one of the areas that I've been working on a lot, I'm going to talk about on Friday, is community protests, where those are not organized by a formal organization, they're organized by various small committees and so on, but they very definitely do not explicitly challenge the ANC. And they're quite careful not to challenge the ANC. As the ANC, what they challenge is the local leadership, or the local councillors, the local forms. But they do not go out and say, we are opposed to the ANC as such. And then they experience violence, they experience arrests and stuff like that, but not on this kind of scale. But the one movement that has experienced this kind of violence, a kind of violence of attrition, in which there have been several assassinations, is Abahlali Basentjololo. Why? Because it's a formal organization which is explicitly outside the ANC. It's not explicitly anti-ANC, but it's non-ANC. It's outside the Tripartite Alliance, and it won't talk the language of the Tripartite Alliance. To a movement that grew up in many ways, actually, evolved out of the Cold War. It didn't evolve out of the Cold War, but a lot of its rhetoric and a lot of its orientation in the world grew out of the Cold War. I mean, I do recall being in meetings of unions, internal closed meetings during the 1980s, where people unionists, trade unionists, who were putting forward an alternative position, a different position from the prevailing position in COSATU, were typified as agents of the CIA. A kind of absurd rhetoric, a kind of bizarre rhetoric. But it seems to me that that's the rhetoric of movements in the Cold War period, where those who had different views or those who were outside of the structure could be typified as traitors, as highly problematic, as belonging to some kind of alien and enemy force, and acted against accordingly. And I do think the rhetoric of the ANC, of the SACP, and of the NUM, in an attempt to explain this inexplicable thing, this strike, this mass strike, that had struck against the NUM, and destroyed the NUM, and rejected the NUM. This thing that could not be explained by those who were the bearers of the tradition of worker militancy, particularly on the mines. The only way they could explain it to themselves was this was a plot by a third force, a counter-revolutionary movement, a management plot, something like that. It's quite sad to see people trying to tell themselves these stories, but these stories have nasty consequences, and one of those is the Marikana Massacre. So it seems to me that that's the big story, and it's a story that communities that protest have understood. They don't go against the ANC. And Abahlali Basentjololo, which is a mass movement of shack dwellers in informal settlements across the country, is facing the consequences, of assassinations of activists. I mean, the smallest story, I think, is one of police revenge. As the film pointed out, the police do not like their own to be killed. And I mean, the only way I think that one can see that attack on the second copy is one of violent retribution, actually. So those are the two stories that I can see.
Carrie, we'll take a question from you, then one at the back, and then a third one there.
Yes. I mean, what struck me watching this movie again, can people hear?
Yes.
No. This movie again is just the theatricality of it all. That it was like a huge performance, and an inevitable performance, a performance that was moving on towards tragedy, that the whole nation watched, all the media reflected, there was a lot of discussion. And it's as if, despite the interventions of workers, where they were trying to insert a different path, a different way of proceeding, it was as if the nation sees itself as having a certain destiny. It was broken by that one moment in 1994 where we moved in a different direction, but that we have a certain destiny, a certain, if you like, sort of genetic makeup that means that we must inevitably move towards failure, tragedy, a kind of fear and a failure of imagination to see a different way of moving forward. I don't know, that just struck me when I was watching the film. Just to briefly comment on the commission. I mean, I think one of the things that people don't really know about commissions is that you can have different kinds of commissions. You can have a citizenry commission, where citizens get together and conduct a commission. But in South Africa, we tend to go the route of a judicial commission. If you go that route, it is then appointed by the president, and the terms of reference are also given by the presidency. And that means whatever recommendations come out of that commission are really reliant on the president taking them forward, because the aim of the commission is to advise the president on how to proceed. And if that president, as it happened to be an ANC president, happened to be President Zuma, chooses to ignore those recommendations and to not really push the prosecuting authorities into taking action, then you have a fundamental weakness in the commission. I'm not saying there weren't some very positive side effects that's almost unintentional that came out of that inquiry, but I think that is one serious weakness in the commission.
Thanks. Can we go to the back?
Thank you. Good evening. So, what I really found interesting most, I think, from the Marikana Commission, the Marikana video, was how central Ramaphosa is in this whole situation. And I'd like to really get a question to that. The assumption was because Ramaphosa was someone from the unions and he was now strong within the ANC, but he did not do anything. And now linking to what was then further on said about EFF, how EFF are now speaking this left populist movement of being a vanguard of the people. So Ramaphosa is supposed to be a vanguard. That to know EFF, we don't know where that's going. But that's the question I'm trying to lead to, that within this vanguardism that we try to create, I think, as intellectuals too, that's an important question. When do we flip in terms of actually playing our part in this role? And then the next question is about how state and capital becomes so intertwined. And so it's very clear how the police was essentially now a private army for London. And then my question on this is then, what options do workers have? I know Karl said that community protests are maybe one option, but then when the state and the capital agree, in this case, like the workers, what options do the workers have? What outlet can they use for them to actually not just air the grievances, but to actually get results? I speak this maybe as a Zimbabwean. I'm thinking how the state and capital in Zimbabwe is very strongly linked. Any protest, your only option is to then protest. But where do you protest to?
Thank you. We'll take a question there, and then I'll take a fourth one here before we close the round.
Okay, my question is for Crispen. I just wanted to find out from you, when you were presenting, you were talking about the mining companies now employing ex-soldiers. And I just wanted to find out the decision to employ from Angola, and I think you said Mozambique, why those particular places? And also, what are the relations between the workers and now this? Are these soldiers militarized, first of all? Are they armed at the mining companies? And if there is like a militarization of mining companies, what is the social relations with the workers? And will this lead to another Marikana? Because now it's private security on their workplaces.
Thank you.
So my question is about publicity and the fact that, as somebody else said before, this seems to be a play that the whole nation was watching even before the massacre. And from a political calculation perspective, once the conflict is publicized, it seems to me that the decision to use violence is a quite irrational one because of all the political costs that it carries. I mean, even though, as we saw, many of the people who are suspected of being behind that decision did not end up in jail, and in fact ended up in quite opposite places to jail, it still is striking that with that level of publicity, anyone would make that call. And I guess the story of police revenge would sort of solve that puzzle in the sense that it was not a political calculation, right? But then I do not think, or well, I guess it's a question, it's like, can the police really make that call by itself? Which, from what I've been hearing and from the movie, I feel is unlikely, right? And then if it was a political decision, then how could it be made with that level of publicity?
Thank you. Crispen, Karl?
Okay, thanks for the question. And then I would the question around the ex-soldiers. I think the use of ex-soldiers from Angola and Mozambique, I think it's became part of the strategy by mining capital to these soldiers. They are they're violence specialists. It's one of the strategies, but it became one of the strategies by the mining how to deal with the question around violence. So they had to respond to by sort of like engaging, making use of these violent specialists. And then the question around Ramaphosa at the time, who was one of the directors at Lonmin. I think he, even during the time when I was doing my interview, it's quite a very difficult sort of character even to the workers themselves, because on one hand, they see him as one of their heroes, someone who sort of like the founder of the first sort of like real sort of black trade union movement, the National Union of Mine Workers. So especially when you talk to the senior mine workers who have been there since the 80s at that time, they would say he's part of us. They would see him as part of the working class sort of like movement. And at the same time, at that time, he was a director of Impala. But I think for us to have a very sort of like in-depth understanding to this contradiction, perhaps maybe we need to refer to, I think, the work of Danba Moody, who sort of like done some extended research on the history of the NUM, where he argues that in actual fact, when you see the NUM, it emerged out of it was a strategy. It emerged out of the strategy of one of the mining capital, out of the initiative of Anglo America. Is the one Anglo sort of like it's one that initiated the formation of the NUM back in 1982 and engaged Ramaphosa as one of the persons that spearheaded the formation of the NUM. That's the argument that Danba makes in his article. And then what option do the workers have when the state out at capital sort of like they are working in unison? I would say in this case it's much more complex. With the state, capital, and the union, they all work one hand in glove. So the option that remains for the workers was for them to organize outside these formal sort of like institutions of industrial relations, and unfortunately we end up with the massacre.
Thanks. So, just very, very quickly. So, I mean, on Kelly, on this question of the air of inevitability, in the sense of this as a destiny, I mean, I do think that in a way the way the film is constructed creates that kind of an experience, because it starts off with saying 6 days before the massacre, so it's setting it up as something inevitable. And I think that's problematic. And I think, let me not say it's a time-honored movie, strategy, but I think that one must bear in mind how that constructs for the viewer a sense of what's happening, a sense of the inevitability, and it may not have been that inevitable. And that's actually where I want to come to this. I think it comes to Jacinto's question or comment, which is that given the amount of publicity, the kind of eyes that were trained on the strike, it seems crazy for any politician to make the calculation that let's have a massacre, you know, in front of the cameras and in front of everything else. And I think that so I don't think the research has been done. I think that there's quite a lot of material in the Commission that helps one to move in the direction of understanding what was going on, at least what happened behind the scenes. And again, I think that the movie perhaps conveys an impression that is not necessarily accurate in relation to that. So my guess would be that this happened more in the way that many, you know, very important historical episodes happened, which is that there's a series of decisions that are made prior to the event in different places by different institutions. For example, the police with their own issues of revenge. And political, and the emails from Ramaphosa in with his status as both an ANC, NEC member and a director in London and a shareholder in London. A series of things happen that produce a kind of concatenation of forces and interests. And on the day, these take a particular shape. In retrospect, you might say, well, this looks, it looks kind of inevitable if you put all of this stuff together. This is where it's going to end. But it's not necessarily the case that is so in practice. So I don't think that Ramaphosa imagined something like the massacre. I think it was beyond his imaginings. He was imagining a forceful police intervention that would criminalize this stuff, get rid of the weapons, and start arresting workers for having murdered other workers and cops and so on. It took this form on a kind of set of police calculations and other political calculations that produced this situation. One thing that is important that I think I had to nip out of the film for a couple of minutes and I'm not sure if it's in there, but was when the police actually on the day instructed 4 mortuary vans to make themselves available on the scene. I'm not sure if that's in the film. It is, okay. So, I mean, that clearly suggests that amongst the police there were anticipations of this kind of thing. And then, so what I can say there is that, you know, if this is a repertoire which has apartheid period roots, you know, the apartheid police could do such things and it wouldn't be found out. And somehow there's a kind of a reflex action which says, well, we are protected by important political interests. It's not, you know, we are protected. It's not going to come out. And yet, we are democracy and things do come out. And that's one of the differences, perhaps, from the apartheid period. There was something else that I was going to say about that. Yeah, so I think that there's a way in which, in some respects, something like this is almost like an accident, made up of bits and pieces that together produce almost inevitably this kind of result. If I think of whatever else it was, I don't know. On the EFF and where it's going, Ramaphosa, where he went, look, I don't know. I mean, I was struck by how he spoke in those early days when he was the NUM leader, when looking at the movie. I mean, how his voice is exactly the same as it is now. It's not the voice of a militant worker leader. He was always a lawyer. I mean, he was. I mean, make no mistake, he was a popular leader, and he led the NUM very, very effectively, I think. But nonetheless, there's perhaps elements within who he was that point in this direction. But more important is actually the nature of power and the experience of power. And I mean, I happen, you know, a transition like ours being what it is, I've been in places of power myself. I've been in the National Planning Commission and I've watched the Trevor Manuel, the Cyril Ramaphosa, all in the Planning Commission. And people who inhabit those places are so removed from popular reality, inhabit a world that is so different in all of its kind of ways of apprehending the world and in the logics that shape it and determine it, that I think that they live in some ways according to different rules. And the EFF, you know, to the extent that it's gaining power, may well be experiencing similar kinds of transformations, which is one of the reasons why several of the movements that have emerged in the last few years, including at least elements within Fees Must Fall and the workers in Marikana, avoided forming formal structures, because they see what happens to leaders. Leaders in formal structures get absorbed into the prevailing powers, which are the ANC, and become unaccountable. And so they seem to be preferring forms of organization that are more fluid, more flexible, more horizontal, and so on. With a whole lot of downsides as well. I mean, there are problems with that kind of organization. Yeah.
Thanks, Carl. We just approaching 6:15, and I think we're going to have to wrap up for this evening. I really do want to thank Karl and Crispen for their inputs, their insights, all of you for your questions and your comments. I'm sure that we're going to have an opportunity to pick this up during the course of the next 2 days. Karl, do you want to talk a little bit about some housekeeping matters?
I've got no housekeeping to talk about at all. I can't think of anything housekeeping to be done. I'll tell you if I can.
So we will resume at, I think it's 9 tomorrow morning. 9 tomorrow morning. Karl, can you just refresh my memory about this evening?
Yes, so we've got a dinner arranged for the participants for us to get to know each other a bit well. I'm not sure that we're going to be able to fill all the seats. A number of participants aren't here. I don't know if you want to do anything with that. No. We might engage in some patronage and invite individuals to join us.
Okay, thank you. So, colleagues, thank you very much for the day. We will resume and reconvene tomorrow at 9 o'clock. Thanks very much.